We are live.
Hmm. Okay. Are we live on Facebook? I think
Yes, we are.
uh, just a few seconds. I think. Um, Good evening, everyone. This is Shayoni, on behalf of Voyages into the Past. It is my distinct honor to welcome everyone to today's discussion titled History, Memory, and the City Remembering and Forgetting in Contemporary Delhi with historian and author Swapnalari and Professor Saeed Ahmed. Voices into the Past is a student-led social science outreach organization working to bridge the gap between classrooms and the wider world. It is constantly endeavoring to make knowledge free and more accessible for people through an open platform to discuss, debate, and discourse. The question of what role memory plays in history forms a significant aspect of understanding how narratives and identities are constructed. They function as sites of memory wherein the past is tied to the present. In current political climate of polarization, with particular communities being dispossessed, such intersecting aspects of memory and history, albeit slippery and sensitive, acquire a heightened importance. In December last year, the NDMC threatened to demolish the Sunheri Bagh Masjid for the expansion of a roundabout. At the end of January this year, the medieval Akhunji Mosque and the near Qutub Minar in Mehrauli and the oldest Sufi shrine in Delhi, that of Haji Rosbi, were demolished in the name of clearing encroachments. These events cannot be viewed in isolation, considering the recent political milieu. Thus, larger questions surrounding heritage, how essential they are in forming identities and holding memories of people, and what happens when they are altered, physically erased, or distorted in their narratives, are also needed to be addressed. To answer these questions, we are today joined by our well-known historian and former convener of the Delhi chapter of Intact, Swapna Little. Her book, The Broken Script, explores key events in Delhi between 1803 and 1857 and their impact on different groups of people, and their relations and ways of thinking and belonging. She is also an art curator and heritage conservator who has been vocal about the protection of the historic structures in Delhi, particularly in recent days with the demolition threats surrounding Sunheri Bagh Masjid and those in Mehrauli. Also joining us as moderator for today, Saeed Ahmed, Assistant Professor at the Jindal School of Art and Architecture of OP Jindal Global University. His works are focused on post-colonial and contemporary India, examining the material and social productions of Delhi through interdisciplinary questions of migration, heritage displacement, memory, infrastructures, and religious conflicts. I now open the floor to our two speakers for today.
Thank you so much, Ayani, for the lovely introduction to the today's talk. And I would, I would just like I'll just take 5 minutes to sort of discuss what we'll be talking about today, and then hand over to Professor Little. Um, and Essentially, I want to start with a very simple story, far removed from the contemporary context. We'll go back into history, which is the story of Berlin in Germany, right? So in the 1990s, Berlin was, of course, the Berlin Wall fell down, and the Soviet Union, in a way, lost. And a number of activists, academics, and the German government at the time started debating the question of the city's heritage, because the city had been divided ever since the Second World War. It was divided between the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc. Lines were literally drawn. Neighborhoods were divided, and there was there was a lot of debate and concern about which past of Germany do we remember, because this was also the capital city. Because you had the Prussian past before the emergence of Germany as a unified nation. You had the Nazi part. You had the Weimar Republic, which preceded the Nazi past. Then you had essentially two pasts of the city. after following the Second World War. And in those debates, there were always discussions, okay, about what structures are to be left, what structures are to be demolished, what structures are to be preserved. And this didn't just include government buildings, but it also included neighborhoods, it included roads. What would be the identity of these spaces? Could we erase certain buildings, like, for example, the office of the SS, um, or keep it there as a reminder of a national shame of a Nazi past? How do we remember the Jews that were driven away, that were murdered by the Nazi regime? There were various solutions. So, of course, there's something called Stolpersteins in Germany, which are stones outside of houses of Jews who were displaced, whose properties were confiscated, to sort of remember them. There is, of course, a lot of debate in contemporary Germany about whether they are disrespectful or respectful of that past. There were also neighborhoods, for example, Kreuzberg and Neukölln. These were immigrant neighborhoods that came up on the edge of Western Germany, on the edge close to the wall with Eastern Germany, consisting where Yugoslav and Turkish immigrants following the Second World War were allowed to settle. That was the only place they were allowed to settle. Once the wall came down in the 1980s, the regime wanted to, I mean, some people would call it renew, some people would call it gentrify these neighborhoods. There was, by this time, a number of artists had started moving in. There was a major squatting movement to preserve the sort of migrant identity of these spaces. But in the end, neoliberalism won, and of course, these neighborhoods are extremely gentrified now, and the sort of their identity of being migrant neighborhoods is still there, but it is at times overshadowed by being the sort of hipster districts in Berlin. Now, what this story that I've sort of rushed through actually tells us is the questions of built heritage are animate discussions across diverse range of actors and groups, and they are influenced by questions of power. They are influenced by questions of political economy. They are influenced by questions of erasure or absence and presence. And essentially, the idea today is to talk about the built heritage, especially in a city like Delhi that has an extremely layered history, and has always had a contested past. Um, and that's why Professor Little, who is an expert in this, who is an inspiration for many of us younger Delhi scholars, will now talk about remembering and forgetting in contemporary Delhi. So over to you, Professor Little.
Thank you so much. Though I must confess, you have dignified with me with the appellation professor. I'm not professor at all. Just Swapna will do. But thank you for framing that so well, because this is the story of everywhere. And every time, really, in our past, as historians, often we have this sense of deja vu, that we see so many things which we see happening around us, which we have seen in the happening in the past, and we can see that it's again and again happens. But really, what I plan to do today is, you have laid out the framework so well that I am going to concentrate really on looking at certain examples from Delhi. And I must confess that it's Delhi simply because that's what I'm familiar with. And I'm going to take examples from Delhi to talk about how exactly does this work in practice? How is it what we choose to remember? What we choose to remember, and how are those memories are tied to places, and how we seek to appropriate those memories, how we seek to what we forget, what we remember, when we remember it. That also, these are all things which are of some interest. And I have like I often do, I've put together a few images. These are mostly archival paintings, or some are photographs, some are contemporary photographs, to help to put some of these thoughts together. And I hope that once that we go through those some of those stories, you will have more questions that might occur, and we might have people who want to know more or discuss this a little further. So I'm going to go and share my a small PowerPoint I have, and we see how we go from there. Yeah. So I think uh, the as I said, I'm going to use some examples from Delhi, and one of the what is special about Delhi, and I'm going to talk about Delhi and the Mughals specifically, because the Mughals, though the earlier Mughals, even Akbar ruled for a little while from Delhi, but then moved to Agra. He moved the capital to Agra. Jahangir ruled from Agra. In fact, even before the Babur had come to uh, India and defeated Ibrahim Lodi, the Lodis also had actually ruled from Agra for a while. But for various reasons, which I won't go into now, there had been growing this whole aura of a sort of a aura of power around Delhi, which, because it had been associated for a significant amount of time from the early years of the Sultanate with, as the capital of a powerful empire, it had in time developed this aura of power. And a interesting thing that happened during Akbar's time, and this is something that is analyzed very well by Cynthia Talbot. Uh, she talks about how Akbar's chronicler, somebody like Abul Fazl, for instance, uh, constructed a sort of a lineage for Akbar, almost not a lineage in a family way, but in a lineage in the way of a line of rule going back through the Sultanate, through the Chauhans, through the Tomars. These are all dynasties which had at one point ruled from Delhi, uh, though the Chauhans had not, but this was something that was constructed in a sense of, you modify history a little bit and the memory a little bit to go back to a sort of a mythic past where Delhi was very specifically identified by with a mythic the Indraprasth of the Mahabharata, which says that the Pandavas, the heroes of the Mahabharata, found this city at this place called Indraprasth. And Indraprasth is, again, in legend, believed to be the place where Indra had carried out sacrifices. Why this becomes important at a particular time is when, in the middle of the 17th century, Shah Jahan decides to build a capital city. And he decides to build a capital city not he was already in Agra. He decides to go back to Delhi to build that city. Remember, his father has not ruled from here. His grandfather also ruled here for a very short while. But he chooses Delhi, again, I think, in many ways to draw on the power, the aura of power which is associated with Delhi. And he picks a very interesting place to build the city, which is close to a spot which is even today called Nigam Bodh. So Nigam Bodh was one of those. It's directly tied with the story of Indraprasth, because it says that this is where uh, this place was blessed. Because Indra had carried out these sacrifices here, this place was blessed, and it was believed that here, if you take a dip in the water, you will regain your memory. And therefore, you have, again, this story that Brahma, who forgets the Ved, he loses his memory of the Veda. And then he takes a dip in this water here and regains that memory. So this is a spot which is considered sacred. And I believe it is possible that Shah Jahan, for various reasons, picked Delhi. And it could not be too much of a coincidence that he picked this particular spot to build the fort, the citadel, which you at this picture you see. It's a 19th century painting, but you see the main citadel of the city that he founds. The city is called Shahjahanabad, which today we know as Old Delhi, and this overlooks the river, and it overlooks the river at that very point that is pretty much very close to the point that is called Nigambodh. Now, in doing that, Shah Jahan is drawing on the memory of a place, the memory of how sacred this place is. That is what he's drawing on. And let us have a look at the kind of detail, just one point of the kind of city that Shah Jahan wants to build. This is really a photograph taken by me about 15 years ago, which is a close up of the previous one. If you look at the previous slide, you will see a golden dome in pretty much the middle of the picture. This is a close up of that. This is a building with a window in it, which is called the Jharokai Darshan. This is where the Mughal emperors used to give darshan to their subjects. Now, darshan was again a concept which the Mughals had borrowed from Shah Jahan, Jahangir. They had borrowed this from the other legacy of their families. They are, of course, the descendants of the great conqueror Temur, but they were also descendants of various Mughal rulers. And much of that legacy also formed a part of their, not only their family legacy, but their court practice, their what they projected, and the image they projected of themselves. So this Jharokai Darshan is where the Mughal emperor every morning used to sit for a couple of hours, or maybe not a couple of hours, a little less than a couple of hours, maybe an hour or so every morning. And people could see him. They knew that everything was well with the empire. If the emperor was alive and well, they could sometimes present their petitions to him also. And in fact, you have this painting which shows Aurangzeb sitting in the Jharoka. Though Aurangzeb had, after a while, discontinued this practice, but this is a painting again from a period later than Aurangzeb's time, but it shows Aurangzeb sitting in that Jharoka. So the memory here is one that seeks a time of a political power, of a time of regimes, practices, to a place on the river which is considered of spiritual significance. It is also a place, and the ghats, where a lot of people used to come and take a dip in the river in the morning. People used to come and bathe in that river in the morning, and they would then take that dip in the river. They would then see the emperor in the Jharoka, and contemporary chroniclers say that they would feel blessed by that. That's the Mughal narrative around this. The kind of city that the Mughals then proceed to build is typically, we know it has, there are historians, of course, scholars who have talked about what is the nature of the city. Again, as I say, for me, it is a typically Mughal city. It reflects this particular ideology of the Mughal emperors. And it is, so it, among its major landmarks, you have the Jama Masjid, but you have also a number of temples, most prominent among them, what was known as, today we call the Digambar Jain Mandir. This has been there from from the time of Shah Jahan, in fact. Parts of it are that old. And this it was built in the neighborhood facing the fort, where Shah Jahan had expressly invited Jain merchants to come and settle. So it is uh, the Mughal ideology is one of Sulh-e-Kul, which is that of trying to bring about a harmony between different communities and different sections of society, and projecting the Mughal emperor as an emperor who promotes these. So the self image of the Mughal emperor was important here. Now, of course, what happens is, as we go down time, uh, Mughal Empire declined. It was in the early 19th century. Delhi uh, came to be ruled by the East India Company, and that East India Company's rule lasted a little over half a century, a little over 50 years, and after that came the revolt of 1857. So during the company period, there was a sort of I won't say a balance of power, because the East India Company was the actual ruler in all ways, legal as well as factual. But the Mughal emperor continued to live in the Red Fort, and was at least an important presence there. And in a lot of people's minds, they continued to associate the Mughal emperor with the legitimate source of power. But 1857 wiped all of that out. I won't go into the story of that. But what happens after 1857 is that when the British forces recapture the city, after 4 months of there being a British free rule in this city, the British come back, they capture it, and they demolish large parts of the city. They capture the citadel, which is the Red Fort. They throw out a lot of people. The Mughal emperor is exiled. The British completely take over the Red Fort. And in the other kinds of violence, that among the other kinds of violence, a lot of it is on the people, residents of Delhi. There is a huge amount of violence on the uh, city itself, the physical fabric of the city. So in this picture, what you see is a map of Shah Jahanabad, a map which was drawn in the middle of the 19th century. And the grayed out areas are really the areas which were largely demolished. Apart from those black dots within the gray areas, those are the exceptions, but a lot of these buildings were demolished. So, what happens with this demolition is, let us look at some of the details. So, for instance, this is the area. It is a image of the Jama Masjid taken from the Red Fort. This a large and flourishing area with neighborhoods, etc., becomes this. It becomes empty. The buildings are wiped out, the neighborhoods are wiped out, the streets and lanes which were in this part of the city are completely wiped out. This is a very poignant photograph of the late 19th century, which shows that so beautifully. I mean, you can almost imagine that these children who are standing on the empty ground represent uh, the neighborhoods or the houses that may have stood here, uh, the families that may have lived here, and they are it's an empty plain. Important. So there were, of course, various landmarks in this area, other areas also. One landmark which was really pretty much the heart of the city was Chandni Chowk. In fact, even today, almost the whole area is called Chandni Chowk. And what you have is, this is as far as I know, the only painting of of the original Chandni Chowk as it existed. It was a square in that city, and this is where uh, anyway, those who are familiar with Delhi will probably know this. uh, Chandni Chowk was also demolished. This was because it was a symbol of the Mughals. This was literally, it had been commissioned by Shah Jahan's daughter Jahanara, and she uh, had this built. So it is completely erased. In its place comes up the town hall. In its place comes up, in the middle of the chalk comes up a clock tower. So it is a way of erasing the memory of the Mughals to put in its place, sorry, to put in its place a British layer shell. Not even layer, it's just remove what was earlier and try to replace that memory with new landmarks. You put up the town hall. And it's very interesting that what that does to memory, because Chandni Chowk, the chalk itself is erased. It is erased, but the name doesn't die out because at some point, what begins to happen is that people begin to call that whole street Chandni Chowk. And even to us today, if you look at it carefully, seems very incongruous because a street can't be called a chalk. Chalk is literally a square. But because I think because that landmark is gone, that when the poet Ghalib was asked what Delhi was, and he said Delhi is no longer there because its important landmarks are gone. And among the landmarks, one of the ones he mentions is Chandni Chowk. He says if Chandni Chowk is gone, how do we say that Delhi is still there? It's just in name. But in a bid to hang on to that memory in some manner, that name began to be applied to the whole street, which is Chandni Chowk. In time, today, a lot of people, in fact, think that the whole of the old city, which was Shahjahanabad, is Chandni Chowk. That scope of that name keeps increasing. Coming back to this particular if you look at the grayed out area, again, the area outlined in red is the Red Fort. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And within the Red Fort, what you can see is, I'm sorry, I've not set up a pointer here, but what you can do is you can look at the area within the Red Fort. Much of this was actually demolished. Or many of the buildings, the courtyards, a lot of the passages were all demolished. What was left were a few isolated buildings. People still continue to try to commemorate some of this lost heritage. How do they do it? So there is one area which was the Meena Bazaar. Now, Meena Bazaar was it was a little market which used to be held inside the Red Fort for the benefit of the ladies who were uh, they were in that sense in parda, in seclusion. They were not people who would have come out into the markets of the city to shop. So the city tradesmen used to send their women with merchandise to go and retail in that market. So it was a market that used to be held for the women of the ladies inside the fort. Now, this memory clearly was still there for a long, long time. People remembered, even though the fort had gone, where the Meena Bazaar was, that was completely destroyed. And of course, the whole institution of the Mughal royal family was gone. But people had memories of how that bazaar used to be held, how women used to go, how they used to retail there. And in a small way of a way to commemorate, to remember, uh, in many, many years later, when in front of the Jama Masjid, this red bottom left of the screen, there is that big red uh, block that is the Jama Masjid. In front of the Jama Masjid, small bazaar was built. And this was many, many years later. That bazaar was named Meena Bazaar. So people are very confused, but you can see where that is coming from. You lose something, you try and recover it elsewhere through a memory. That is how memories often get recorded. But there are there are many different ways in which memory work. This picture, which is from the 1970s, It's a picture from the 1970s. It shows us uh, Gurudwara Sisganj. Sisganj Gurudwara has grown. This is, of course, a 20th century building. These dimensions of the building. It has grown on the spot which was next to the Kotwali, which was the police station. And this was a spot where uh, the Sikh Guru Tegh Bahadur was executed in 1675. Now, this Kotwali Chowk was a uh, major square of the city. And this is why this incident took place over here. At a later point, the later Mughal emperors had given a space here for the building of a shrine in memory of the Sikh Guru. And in modern times, that shrine grew bigger and became this Gurudwara Sisganj. Now, in the around 1870 or so, the British had added a fountain in the middle of this chalk. So you can see that fountain. It's kind of painted white. It's a typical, I would say, in some senses, an Indo-Saracenic type of structure, and it's actually right in the middle of the chalk. Now, I have seen this particular Phavara. And what happened was this became quite a landmark, this particular fountain. In time, the Kotwali was demolished. So what used to be known as Kotwali Chowk began to be called Phavara Chowk, because then this was the landmark that was left on this chalk. So Phavara Chowk is what it was called. Now, I saw this Phavara. This is a photograph taken by me about 15 years ago, which shows that it had been painted blue and white, uh, and a Nishan had come up. Uh, the neighboring Sikh shrine, uh, without too much other narrative or comment, this had come up on the Phavara. Uh, much more recently, there is a further, more clear, more unambiguous re-inscription of this fountain. This was a fountain which has now become the Shahidi Sthal. It is uh, claimed that this marks the very spot on which the Guru was executed. So, what had been a colonial town improvement measure then gets re-inscribed with a memory, but it's a memory that is now coming to the fore many years later, because that memory had existed in the shrine where the Gurudwara is most likely the spot for the execution, because that's right outside where the Kotwali was. The actually this place did not have that particular association, the center of the chalk, but because this is a way of re-inscribing that entire chalk with the memory of the Guru. So this is how in modern times also you can see how memories which are, you would imagine, are long past, are actually not long past and get shall we say, reasserted. And one of those boards there, by the way, says that if names are being changed, why should we not change the name of Chandni Chowk to Guru Tegh Bahadur Chowk? Right? So renaming is the practice of renaming is being invoked over here as something that is positive and can work in favor of this chalk. Another place that was very clearly associated with that Indraprasth was a village which was uh, just where Shahjahanabad is. A little south of that was a village which was known as Indarpat. Now, Indarpat, in popular oral tradition, is associated with the Indraprasth of the Pandavas, which the Pandavas had founded. So there was this village which was actually fairly widespread around the Purana Killa. Now, what happens is part of the village was inside the killa itself. So this is the an image of the Purana Killa, which was actually a fort founded by the Mughal Emperor Humayun, and it has a lot of houses from that village of Indrapat. This is an early 20th century photograph. Now, when New Delhi was built, the British built New Delhi in the early 20th century. When New Delhi was built, all memory of, or rather, let me put it this way, all the structures of the village of Indrapat were removed. They were all removed. The fort was conserved as a monument. So what you have left now is a fort uh, which was clearly built by Humayun, the village of Indrapat. And I'm not saying that the village dated from ancient times. No, it didn't. It dated from a fairly recent time, but it was believed in memory that this was the spot the name Indrapat referred to in the past. So while this village is removed, the memory of that Indraprasth remains. And it is, in fact, it is encouraged in the official narrative also, because the British themselves, in their guidebooks and other things, call it the village of Indraprasth. But what happens is, because the village surrounding the fort, inside the fort goes, now in a lot of memory, in a lot of popular memory, the Purana Killa is referred to as Pandavoka Killa, the fort of the Pandavas, which is completely, by the way, wrong. It's not the fort that is built by the Pandavas, but just that memory which is being invoked. And then let us come to very, very recent times. Or rather, this is a story post independence, which is the story of the village of Mehroli. And we were talking about Mehroli just now. Mehroli, a very important landmark is the Dargah of Qutub Bakhtiyar Kaki, a very prominent Sufi of the Chishti Silsila. And his Dargah is over here. And in front of the Dargah, there is a gate. And this gate, quite a long time ago, so this was a gate which was built in the 16th century by Sher Shah Suri, and it has these two piers. You can see a white pier, and across the road, sort of something which is clearly more stone and brick. But this half of at some point in its history, this half was taken over by a gurudwara and painted, right? And it became incorporated into a gurudwara, which another modern gurudwara building right next to it. Now, this is likely to have happened sometime after. There was a bit of a history to this, because what had happened was that in the violence of partition, the Dargah had been taken over by people coming from West Pakistan, who had thrown out the people who were the khadims of the Dargah. They had been thrown out, and it had been taken over. So, in fact, Mahatma Gandhi, when he goes on his last fast before he was assassinated, he actually, one of his demands was that the Dargah should be handed back to its legitimate caretakers. So this was a contested space, and this half was taken over, and this has remained for a long time. But what I can see recently, I'm sorry, one picture has gone. But what I can see recently is that there has been a further move to take over the other side of the gate also, and inscribe it with a particular very clear narrative of another Shahidi Sthal of Banda Bahadur. Banda Bahadur again was a Sikh military leader, actually, who was executed over here because he had risen up against the Mughal regime. And he was a political and military challenger to the Mughal regime, and therefore he had been executed over here. So very recently, and I'm talking about 5-6 years ago, there is more explicit reinscription of the site by a memory which doesn't seem to have troubled anyone for centuries. This happened in this took place in the early 17th century, early 18th century. Between the early 18th century till quite a way into the our century here, 21st, nobody's thought about it too much. But recently, there is a revival of that memory of inscribing this as a site of conflict. There are other places also which lastly, I will talk about this, which is Coronation Park. Coronation Park is a place where colonial memories go to die. Colonial memories, of course, were inscribed in the form of not uh, statues are the most problematic form of that memory, because statues are so obviously in your face, so unambiguous in their political intent to be put on landmarks. And I can understand why it was thought necessary after independence to get remove these statues from a very obvious prominent position right in the middle of the central vista, for instance, in the middle of Vijay Chowk, etc., where these statues were. One was under the Chhatri right next to India Gate. These statues were removed. They were moved to Coronation Park. Now, more recently, there has been a landscaping of the Coronation Park. And that was something that was actually suggested by Intact, that these statues should be treated as uh, art heritage, which they are. They are pieces of art, and certainly they don't probably belong in the Central Vista, or maybe not near next to India Gate. But that does not mean that you leave them to deteriorate in some field, as was happening. This is a photograph again taken about 15 years ago by me. And Intact suggested a landscaping of this area, which is known as Coronation Park, and a creation of not only a sort of a gallery of these statues of various governors general and uh, viceroys, etc., but also an interpretation center which will talk about colonial history. That the landscaping was done, the statues were installed, but I think even today there are no plaques there and there's no interpretation center. And that's because probably in officially we find it difficult to grapple with colonialism. We don't know how to grapple with it. And there is this odd idea that if we remember in some way, if we talk about colonialism, we are glorifying it. And that becomes definitely then a reason to for this uncomfortable silence. Whereas for history students, of course, we know that talking about colonialism is important precisely because we don't want to glorify it. We want to understand colonialism for what it is. So these are some of the uh, ways in which one remembers, forgets, re remembers, and often remembers after long gaps things that may have been forgotten, or how we want to remember them. Also, losing, uh, I could give a completely new talk on place names, etc., but I've chosen not to do that today. That I will leave for some other time. But thank you very much for bearing with me, and I'll go on to Professor Saeed Ahmed for leave it to him to make his comments here.
Thank you, Dr. Little, for this extremely fascinating talk. So, I mean, I, I have a few questions that emerge from this and around discussions of heritage. So, first would be, how would you define sort of Delhi, for example, is a city that has multiple sets of actors and institutions that define what the city's heritage is. You have official bodies, of course, like the ASI, but you also have bodies like Intact, you have the Waqf Board, you have public history initiatives that seek to define a sort of heritage. But how can we define heritage? Because the process of defining that also involves elements of erasure, right? So I was thinking, like you mentioned the village of Indarpat, and generally, like that was the case with most ruins that were turned into, say, monuments by the British, and it's sort of that, and it involved a process of erasing a particular past of settlement, inhabitation, but also then reinscribing it with some sort of other meaning. And it's I would like to hear more about how then this sort of bureaucratic sort of process translated into, say, the post-colonial period after independence, how the independent Indian state saw heritage, and how then basically how some legacies of that sort of bureaucratic tendency are already there. If,
Oh yes, there is the Indian state in that sense is in its bureaucratic machinery is pretty much a successor to the colonial state in terms of what the ASI does. It's uh, On the other hand, what happens with uh, the ASI also over periods is I think always the dilemma is whose history, whose memory, whose heritage are we safeguarding, whose are we not. So what often happens is that whereas things like uh, one of the things that continues to happen is the the very uneven way in which a monument is protected. So if you look at the prohibited area around monuments, etc., very often it is the smallest houses, the humblest houses, that will be the targets of demolition, right? And
yeah,
you can see multi-story flats coming up all around important monuments, and they stay. So
or
there's
market centers like Hoskas village.
yeah. So therefore it is a very uneven way in which rules also are applied, who applies them and in whose for whose benefit. uh, so those kind of things definitely still carry on. Also what has happened in recent times is which monuments get opened up for worship, for instance. That's been happening for a long time. uh, who puts pressure, who again, where these are denied, where permission is given, these are very very complex questions also.
Yeah. And also, like, I mean, I was thinking about when you were talking about like this whole dilemma around discussing the colonial past, right? um i'm I'm curious about, like, so for example, when there's this, for example, the Central Vista project was coming up, and there was discussion about the heritage of sort um of say Lutyens Delhi, that is going to be sort of demolished, which was associated with particular practices in urban life, that people used to go every Sunday and sort of eat ice cream there, sit under particular trees. But that was a space of leisure for the citizenry. It was a space of pageantry, of course, for the Indian state through the parades. um, and it was like, I mean, Lutyens Delhi was always, I mean, it was a vanity project of the British also, in a sense. But I was wondering what histories the Lutyens Delhi sort of erased in its process, the histories of, say, the villages that were displaced, for example, which now live on mostly in the memories of families that were relocated to, say, places like um, Jangpura Bhogal, or say
Yeah.
Karol Bagh for CP. Um,
The village of Raisina still carries its memory in its new location, right? In Haryana, they have. But I'd like to talk about something very different here, because what we are still we are losing. We've lost and are losing is in the Central Vista redevelopment project is in a large part the history of post-independence India, right? Your Vigyan Bhavan, your Udyog Bhavan, Nirman Bhavan, your National Museum, all of these are going to go, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So, in fact, it's the colonial buildings that are going to stay because they are protected by law, and so the letter of the law is being followed there for colonial heritage, but because it is not explicitly protected by law, the post 1947 uh, uh, moment in Indian history, which is uh, after New Delhi, which was the British Delhi, independent India did not build another city, right? It just took over the older city, but then added its own structures to it. It modified Central Vista in particular ways by adding various structures, various institutions like the National Museum, etc. It is that layer that
yeah.
is being erased by the National Museum, by the Central Vista project. So what we are doing is we are actually erasing the early, not just early, but several decades of the history of the modern nation,
Yeah.
of the early post-independence period. So that is, I'm, and people of my age, we take this for granted. I mean, I know that these buildings stood there, but 20 years down the line, when you'll have all sorts of new structures and very little of that period left, uh, how are you going to look back to the physical evidence of that era in this city?
Yes, that's an extremely pertinent point, because and then we go back to like sort of this entire discussion of questions of inequality and the unevenness of what is to be preserved, what is to be erased,
Yeah.
and what kind of past do we remember. And along those lines, I was thinking of of course, one was the whole point that Sunil Kumar, the historian, made in his present in Delhi's past about, say, when he discusses the Quwwatul Islam Mosque, and where it says that this sort of there is there is, if we are to disentangle it, there is popular memory around the space, then there is historical memory, which is like historians have produced that history. There are contemporary sources, right? And how do we then, and then there is a state memory also, and depending on the politics of the state, that memory has sort of shifted in various ways. How do we disentangle this as individuals when we are looking at the past, because that is a very difficult exercise, when, as sort of the description also say, the past is up for grabs, and when you have heritage is always contested, but how do we disentangle this? Because like Kuwat al-Islam, sort of popular memory sort of bled into the historical writing itself, and gave the Kuwat al-Islam mosque a particular kind of identity that was not its intention at all, and where historians were equally responsible for this sort of um, it's sort of image that emerged.
So, in fact, when people ask me, I do heritage walks around Delhi, and anytime somebody comes to me and said, "I want to do a walk with you," sometimes college students come to me and said, "Please take us for a walk." I said, "Qutub Minar chalo," because that's my place of choice. Because I feel that there is so much to be told and explained, which is not explained. And what used to happen was that for a long time, and I blame our post independence ASI for this, that they did not undergo this decolonization, shall we say, a critical understanding of something like Qutub Minar. They, instead of relying on somebody like Sunil Kumar to tell them about or interpret Qutub Minar complex, or even VD Chattopadhyay, or people like this who've done interesting work on interpreting some of the texts around them, the inscriptions, etc., instead of talking to those people, they continue to rely on colonial texts. Colonial archaeologist Joe Cunningham has said once is now written in stone. I mean, so instead of, and up to the time that the politics of the state, you subscribe to a sort of secular kind of values, you were kind of embarrassed about that part of what you believed was the past of Qutub Minar as temple destruction, etc. And so you brush it under the carpet and say nothing about it. So the site is left blank. The ASI does not put in the kind of signage that could maybe highlight some of those interesting background to the site. And because it is left vacant, it is filled with all sorts of popular inscriptions, including the guides who used to always give these fantastic stories about the site. And now, if you go there, one inscription which deals with temple destruction is taken completely out of context and it is placed at the beginning of the site, right? That is something the ASI has now done without any other context. So, uh, these are things, and that's why I say that even things that we might at first sight think this is a complex thing, uh, we should grapple with it. We can't ignore it, because if you keep a silence and you don't talk about it, it is liable to be then filled with all sorts of misinformation as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, talking about, I mean, sort of the silence that is there, and I guess this would be the last question. Then we can perhaps open it to the chat for people who want to ask. And I was thinking about, say, how we remember, say, old Delhi, right? Or we remember Delhi in generally, right? There are a number of public history initiatives that are underway that are attempting to preserve a sort of vanishing sort of syncretic past, right? But sometimes there is in the process of discussing this syncretic past, of proximate religious structures, modes of living, celebrating festivals together. There's sort of an illusion, a sort of a forgetting, or sometimes a suppression, at least in my how I've observed it in some instances, of the contested nature of urban life and the conflicts that actually animated the entire city before in the build up to the partition, which is something another event that we really haven't re- as a nation really reconciled with. And in the sense that those very streets that were spaces of conviviality, coming together, and also turned into points of clashes between religious groups. And in a sense, how do we how do we remember that past? How do we deal with this sort of contested past that's always been there? Does the remembering of a vanishing past only include the sort of the glorification of, say, particular practices, particular spaces, and particular languages associated with communities? uh, how do we avoid the danger of fetishizing
Yeah, yeah.
this past, and instead of actually acknowledging the messy nature of history?
uh, uh, what we are both, I think, at some level fantasizing about is a much greater appreciation of history and the processes and methods of studying history among a general public. There is this, unfortunately, this is a struggle that we always have to try and, uh, because history is so charged with political questions of identity and conflict, and all our present anxieties are projected back into history, that becomes so difficult. And uh, it is, I find that it's very difficult to really have conversations which are about history without romanticizing, without and talking about and not having stakes such I think the first thing that we need to do is to not have not take it so personally. We don't have to draw lines and say I am on the side of the Mughals, I am on uh, the side of whoever it was who I mean you don't have to, because that is the first thing. And unfortunately that is what has happened to history, is that you have to take sides, and you have to take sides, and you have to your positions have to be very clear. You cannot look at the messiness that is history, and that is I mean I don't pretend that there are easy answers, particularly as it has become more difficult to talk about history in have sensible discussions about history, because people do take such strong positions, and in a outside the discipline it has become so uh, we are in some senses sometimes one feels beleaguered to try to explain to people how history really works, or how studying history works. So I'm sorry, I have no thoughts on that at all.
But yeah, I mean, I always have this in my head that I see certain practices and I'm like, okay, but there is, why do we need to, I mean, there is, we can look back to a certain past, yet that past is
Yeah,
also has elements of conflict,
yeah, of
which was
course.
essentially one of, say, the problems of, say, the Nehruvian regime, which sort
Yeah,
of brushed a lot of things under the carpet, which then
yeah,
exploded by the 1980s.
yeah,
uh, and we are in a particular historical moment now
yeah,
because of some aspects of that suppression. um, but yeah, I think we could open the chat um, to the general public, and if they have questions, I think.
That was a very engaging discussion. Uh, Till now, we have had one question. So it is from Shamning Bhattacharya. He asks that thank you, Dr. Levy, for the wonderful. I know from first-hand experience, sources that I cannot reveal, that there are unofficial but equally forceful orders to not conserve or display, even remove Muslim and European art from museums financed by the government. How do you see this, and what can citizens do to resist this erasure? Case in point, the Victoria Memorial Hall, Kolkata, now has three closed galleries and none of the miniatures or oil paintings on display.
uh, I've been we've been talking about memory, and I think one of the things is to try and keep memories, uh, to keep restating those. When it was decided that the National Museum would be closed indefinitely in order to relocate the collections to another look unspecified as yet space, and for an unspecified time. And one of the things that I and a few friends of mine, we work on something called the History Collective. We have a small group of historians, and we decided that we will go to those of us who are in Delhi, we'll go to the National Museum as often as we can and photograph as many of the objects as we can, just to talk about them. And some of them, so we photograph them just as a matter of documentation for our own benefit, but also then started to share some of those with others, with the public, through social media, talking about those objects, what their significance is, why they're important, etc. So again, it is a sort of battle against forgetting. If you can talk about a place as it once was, as you remember it, that that as citizens, and I'm not talking about the more, of course there are other ways of activism, etc., but since we are talking specifically about memory here, that is one that I would say.
We have another question from Udita Ghatok. She says, it would be really helpful if, ma'am, you could emphasize on how does the hierarchization of memory in urban life lead to this selection bias, creating an unequal landscape of power structures?
uh, Hierarchization, you know uh, in our kind of a city like Delhi, which is, because it is a capital city, the official narrative always has a lot of primacy. uh, in monuments, a place like Central Vista, which is it's the locus of the state. So what happens there? That's a completely you know at one level you feel that a citizen has no role there at all. Normally speaking, one would imagine that a citizen would decide what their city looks like, what their neighborhood looks like. But often, uh, and in India generally, I feel I'm not saying I have experience of every state, but I would say that often uh, interests of the state runs roughshod over citizens. And let me give you a very good example. In front of the Lal Killa, in front of the Red Fort, you will see a big green Maidan. It's covered in grass. It is out of bounds for anybody. It's completely fenced off. It just works as a sort of uh, a foreground for the red walls of the Red Fort. That When I first came to Delhi in the 80s, in the middle 80s, that used to be an open ground where the children of Shahjahanabad tends to be quite crowded, so there are not too many empty playgrounds, etc. People used to relax there, sit and have their lunch or whatever. There were children playing there, major games of all sorts happening. It was a public space that was fenced off, it was beautified, uh, and completely taken away from the people. And nobody raised a voice. Nobody really talked about it. I mean, one would imagine that a neighborhood where your only open space where your children could play gets taken away from you, you would be out in the street protesting. And I think we need to talk about what is it about us and our relationship with the state that we don't do those things, right? Uh,
Uh, can I can
Yes.
I just add something to this? Yeah, I was also thinking that in the sense that um, we are also not the citizen is not. I mean, if the citizen is sort of an idealistic sort
yeah,
of category, right? I mean, we are unequal in terms of
yeah,
the way we act as citizens, also,
yeah.
and in terms of, say, the questions of power and hierarchy. Uh, who gets to speak for a particular past has also determined how, say, we remember history in Delhi. So even if we are to remove the state from
Yeah.
this equation, um, it is, I mean, largely Delhi's social cultural elite, because they many of Delhi's social and cultural elite are no longer the economic elite because of how the city's political economy, how the city is now functions. But largely the social and cultural elite have spoken for these pasts. And that has also led to a certain kind of hierarchy in what pasts are remembered.
Right.
So for example, I mean, if we can take the example of, say, um, certain elements of Old Delhi will be remembered, certain elements of Nizamuddin will be remembered as, say, spaces of continuous inhabitation, but also a syncretic culture of the Sufis, of particular practices, of food. Yet a working class neighborhood like, say, beyond Jamia, right, which has been rising since the 1980s essentially, doesn't have much of a memory, and that is also part of an urban heritage, yet it doesn't figure. um, Perhaps because I don't know, of course, but what the process of selection is, it's the people who talk about it. But I mean, perhaps because it's not got any grand structures, it's not got any. These are shanties, just like haphazard housing, which may not look picturesque, and which is why I had the question of fetishization of
Yeah, yeah,
how
yeah,
how we might slip into that, and that how power can also, it determines it even amongst the citizens.
yeah, 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 definitely. Yeah,
Uh, if I could add to that, I think majority of the public aren't even aware how they can speak up for these things, and even if they put petitions forward, will they be heard by the state? So I think those things also get into the conversation of how like for example, we I live in Kolkata, and I have seen numerous buildings being tagged as Bipodjanok, like it is very dangerous to be around it and can fall off any moment. So we don't know what can be done regarding that. Um, we have another question here from Shaptoki. This is, I recently came across an article in the Economic Times on how heritage structures were vanishing from ASI listings because they are often demolished even without people getting to know. Of course, there is state policy and political ideology at play in deciding their fate. There are also many tombs and heritage structures within, say, congested localities of Morali. So, how do the communities living around these perceive these structures?
uh, since we're talking about the kind of social inequalities, etc., over here, often what happens is that you have for a lot of people who live in areas like Mehroli village. Of course, there is one people who live in the houses which are on the village. Then at the fringes in the park, you will have a sort of people who have migrated into the city over the last few decades. They find footholds in different places, and a part of that has been this the occupation of the first available space that you have, which is often an empty tomb, which you become, which you then move into, and you use it as a house. Now, often what happens is whenever you come to a position like encroachment removal drives, what will happen is that that is the soft target for removal of encroachment. Whereas a lot of the bigger, we've noticed this in Mehroli Archaeological Park, that when we talk about the major problems of the management of the park, those are ignored, and it is this soft target that is often taken, right? Clear so called encroachment. And yes, these are heritage structures or legally protected structures which ought to be looked after in a particular way, but you can't see the wood for the trees because you are focusing on what is convenient for you as as I said, a soft target, rather than looking at bigger issues of why is it people move in here, what does it say about housing situations, what does it say about access to all sorts of facilities, not only just housing, etc. So therefore, how people relate to them, people don't think about, you've not encouraged them to think about it in any way except their day-to-day struggle to survive in a big city, and to find the first available place there is in order to move into it, because that's all they can do. So therefore, or as I said, in the Mehrauli village, you have these some things which then are picked up and become the focus of a lot of public, shall we say, posturing, like the Banda Bahadur Shahidi Stan and stuff like that. So either that happens, or there is no narrative at all, or no attempt to integrate uh, a local memory with new migrants, with the broader picture of the city, etc.
Another question we have from Vishnupriya Bosha. Thank you, Dr. Little, for an enlightening talk. The discussion was throwing up interesting questions on multiple layers of memory making. Can you throw light more on, if possible, popular perceptions of the colonial or pre-colonial spaces that you were highlighting? Is there any ongoing initiative in Delhi now of recording these popular perceptions?
Uh, uh, to be very frank, contemporary popular perceptions, am not. I'm not the person to ask, because I'm sure there are lots more people who have been working on that. It's not. In fact, Professor here will have a better view of that, I think. But I mean, uh, uh, I would not be able to tell you, but I'm sure there's a lot of narrative going, different kinds of narrative coming up, because, uh, you know, for the last couple of decades, heritage has become something that we talk about. So whether it's in the popular media or any of those kind of things, there's a lot of talk about it. But I mean, to be very frank, I'm not the person to ask.
Udita Ghatak has brought about another question. While speaking of colonial cityscapes, another question that comes to her mind is how memory, cityscapes, and lived experiences relate to each other to develop meanings to urban thought and lifestyle.
Uh, uh, Memory, colonial cityscapes in colonial times, or is it in today's times? Because uh, I live in a even if I live in a colonial cityscape, as in even if I live in the heart of, I don't live in the heart of of British New Delhi, but I do go there quite frequently. I use the place. I don't perceive it as colonial anymore. I mean, I don't give it enough thought, to be very frank. And I think a lot of people will just, uh, in lived experience, I don't know how much that intrudes. The idea that you are living in a colonial cityscape. I mean, I don't know if I understood the question quite right. But, you know, uh, in today's time, okay. Uh, yeah, so then I did get you right. Uh, I'm not sure. I mean, you live in I visited Kolkata recently, and it's very interesting that even now, if you look at your taxi drivers, etc., uh, they still think of Calcutta in terms of the old street names, which are colonial street names, right? And all of those roads have different names now, right? But people are still calling them Theatre Road. People are still calling them uh, whatever their old names were,
Yeah, yeah,
which are many
yeah.
of them are colonial names, but they still persist. So they are there, but they are. I think they've got disassociated from a colonial memory, in the sense that, of course, if you ask somebody and you say why is it called so, then they'll think a little bit and say, oh yeah, because there was some British official or somebody. But it doesn't affect their consciousness on a kind of a daily basis. They're not finding any particular sense of anger or anti-colonial feeling or patriotic feeling which is against that name, right? Because it in your daily life, that thought does not intrude. You just take a name for what it is. It's just a name.
I think yeah, the whole part, the Dalhousie area that still remains, it is one
Yeah. Sorry.
uh, it's but it is just funny to see, like, if even somebody asks us that how it is working, we won't be able to say much about the history of it, although we are living in Kolkata itself. So the names persist, like you said, the names are carried on, but maximum of the people aren't aware of what was happening in
And
that
it
space.
doesn't bother
It's
them.
also, yeah, it's also about use, right? It's about use. It is,
Yeah,
if say a name gets popularized and it's consistently used, that becomes part of the soundscape of
yeah,
of the city, that this is a particular road that you will be going down, and it's, and as more people use it, eventually it just sort of catches on, and becomes the new name, or doesn't.
all the time. Yeah,
It's time, sort of
yeah,
time and repetition sort of works, I think. Yeah. It's,
Renaming structures and areas does not work for that very reason because
yeah.
of the. We have another question from Rajanjani Ghosh. She says, "Respected ma'am, good evening. I'm writing my dissertation on the Jamali Kamali Mosque and tomb. So there's this oral tradition that is attached to the tomb these days portraying the Sufi Sheikh Jamali Kamali as homosexual partners. What is your take on the oral tradition as a source history?"
Oral history is always a little problematic, even for periods that are very close to us in the past, right? Even the memories of people living today. If you, I mean, that's it's an issue that is quite, uh, you know, drop. Rajendrani, if you want, you can just drop me a message on Facebook or something, and I'll try and get back to you with more on this. But uh, oral history pertaining to something that happened 4 5 centuries ago, I would not consider that oral history. I would consider that just a tradition. And even that tradition, one has to investigate very closely to see when that tradition develops, who first said it, where did they hear it, all of those things. At most, you can talk about a current tradition and its history. You cannot use that to reconstruct the history of Maulana Jamali's lifetime. That would be impossible to use memories going back. Oral history would not pertain to that period at all. Sometimes I work on the 19th century. People say, "Have you gone and spoken to people in Chandni Chowk?" And they'll have information. I said, "I'm sorry, but no." If I have to study the 19th century, I have to look at 19th century texts. I have to look at 19th century these things. I cannot talk to somebody in the 21st century and hope that I'll get authentic information on 19th century, what happened in the 19th century, even if they may be living in that place. So that is that.
And yeah, even
I
just can I just, yeah, like memory sources are also, in a sense, not, they can never be the gospel truth, and
Yeah,
that is the job of the historian, to critically investigate and sort of
exactly. Yeah,
unpack those sources that are available to them.
yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
Uh,
Yeah.
I had a question of myself. While you were discussing on the colonial histories, like how ASI focuses more on the colonial writings than more contemporary writers. So we find that even while I try to do my assignments on anything dating back to the 19th or even older times, we find that the colonial archives are the only source of information there. So how do we tackle that problem while we are studying ourselves?
Uh, well, in some cases, colonial archive is important. My problem is not with using the colonial archive. Of course, you use the colonial archive. I myself look at a lot of, all the colonial files and correspondence and all of that, but critically evaluate it from a from the with the training of a historian, right? That is what is important, and that is what I would respectfully submit that the ASI often fails to do. It doesn't keep up with current researches in history, current debates in history. I gave the example of the Qutub Minar and the work of people like V.D. Chattopadhyay, the work of people like Sunil Kumar, which they seem to ignore and take Cunningham's work as gospel. That is the problem. Of course, use Cunningham for, but know where to use and what those are discussion decisions that a historian can make effectively. But I don't know how many historians are in the ASI. Maybe they should be recruiting more. Sorry, I think she's
Yeah,
having
yeah,
some
yeah.
Wi-Fi problems.
Yeah, if more historians are in the ASI, then at least a lot of unemployed PhDs will get jobs.
But seriously, this is one point. I think I seriously feel that need to be a lot more historians in
Yeah,
the heritage space. Let me
yeah,
plug this one bugbear that I have, that there is so much of the heritage space, whether it is heritage walks, whether it is uh, all sorts of social media, little everybody is spouting history to
yeah.
everybody. And there's commercial use of heritage which happens in so many different ways, and I don't see the historians there. Where are the historians? And that's what I would uh, that's what I really ask for, that there should be more historians involved. You have exhibitions, you have museums dealing with the past, which seem to have very few historians providing inputs. So we need to argue for the participation of historians in all these places, in all these uh, heritage spaces, shall we say, the heritage the commodity area of heritage. Sorry, yeah.
So yeah, I think Shiny is having some network issues. So I think we have had many questions, so we can
Yeah.
sort of end it here. So it is with immense gratitude and appreciation that we extend our heartfelt thanks to you, Dr. Swapna Little and Dr. Saeed Ahmed, for generously sharing your time, expertise, and thought-provoking perspectives on a topic so relevant in current times. The discussion has opened to us very interesting questions indeed to explore. Uh, Also, to inform, we will be hosting another talk a few days later by Tanveer Fazal on his latest book, The Practices of State, Muslim Law and Violence in India, as a part of our lecture series on Muslim citizenship and belonging in India on 26th April. Once again, we would like to thank everyone, all the viewers who joined today, and we hope to see you again on more such events in the future. Do like, share, and follow for more such events. You can subscribe to our mailing list at voyagesintothepast.com. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much. It
thank
was
you,
such a
thank you.
pleasure to interact with all of you, and I'm so
Yes,
grateful. Thank you.
yes. Thank you so
Thank you so
much.
much.
That was a very enlightening discussion.